And we'll go ahead and get started with the first question, which is, what opportunities do the Common Core state standards bring for improving English language learner and special education instruction? And we'll just go ahead and start at the end and work our way this way, if you don't mind, Susan.
One thing, having worked with ELLs, is the respect for my colleagues to say, ELLs, we really want to help them. We want to do something for them. We want to make sure they do well. But unfortunately, they're too kind, and many times they lower the expectations. They lower the difficulty of the work in the idea that they're helping them. And in this case, it's really putting ELLs on the map to say, you can't water down the curriculum. You can't give them easier content just so they'll do well. Students can learn, and when teachers have those high expectations, it may not be they get it the first time. There may be other ways to get to where students need to be. But it's the idea that really holding those high standards and having those expectations for the students who themselves will also believe that they can do it. And that's where I really see the wonderful thing with the Common Core state standards, is having those high expectations for all students.
I'll try to use. Sounds like I'm good. One of the things that I think I'm excited about in looking at the Common Core state standards is the issue around looking at all students. And I think we're really trying to address all student populations, not just students with disabilities or English language learners, but all students. And I think collaboration has been the key with our state departments of education and our districts. We're really looking at all students and what can benefit and increase achievement for all students. And so I think collaboration definitely has been key. The Common Core state standards are very rigorous, and so it's forcing us to really sit down at the table and bring all expertise to that table to determine what's best for students with disabilities and English learners. And so I would definitely say that collaboration and working together to look at what's happening in the classroom and everyday instruction. We're looking at the rigor when it comes to looking at what principals are doing in their buildings, what teachers are doing. We have this big movement around teacher effectiveness and what's that going to mean for states. And so I think collaboration, I would say, definitely is the key, and I see that improving instruction for all students.
Good morning. As the last two people have said, the standards are very specific to say these are for all students, not just a few, not just the ones that you want them to be, but for all. And that means at grade level. So all students will have access to grade level content in their classrooms. What makes the standards special in this way is that focus on coherence. So I, of course, come through the lens of mathematics. So when you look at focus on coherence, these are not things that are just implied, but are actually required and are spelled out very specifically in the standards. And when we look at the focus, we really see how that's going to enable teachers, especially teachers working with special populations, at the time to really understand what's important for those students to know in order to be on the path to college and career readiness. So that focus, not just trying to cover tons of topics, but really knowing what are the important things these students need to know so they are on the path to college and career readiness. And the coherence that's built in the standards, where you see how the topics build on each other, how they interrelate to each other, that's going to make it just so much more clear to the teachers as well what progression to use when you're working with these students. So to me, that focus and coherence, as well as just the accessibility to all students, is what is the great opportunity of the standards.
Great. So for me, the Common Core state standards really offer out an opportunity for equity. And in fact, one of the first things David Coleman, who helped, was a primary contributor to the English language arts standards, shared with me is that the reason he was committed to the work was precisely for the purposes of equity. The common, that word, it's not cookie cutter. We're not talking about everyone doing it exactly the same way. That's not what the common really means. But it does allow for shared understanding so that we can have collaboration. And I know when I started as a classroom teacher, they gave me my student list, they gave me my book, and I shut the door, and I thought that I had to do the work by myself, and it was a pretty heavy lift. And so one of the things that I think is really important about working with ELL and special education students is that we do have an inclusive model. Students work with a variety of people across the day, and that opportunity to share an understanding of what the standards are across teachers, regardless of whether it's a math teacher, an English language arts teacher, a technology education teacher, a special education teacher, that shared understanding is what's going to allow for the equity. In terms of English language arts, I've watched students in reading not have opportunities to even begin to work with complex texts, get further and further behind. If you never get an opportunity to see a metaphor, of course you're not going to be able to understand and analyze and use metaphors. So the opportunity in the standards for students to see the kind of rich language and vocabulary that is needed for all students to develop college and career readiness is just a really exciting thing.
I'm looking at the continuum of education and special education, and I think back that in only 1975, we passed special education legislation that said that students with disabilities could attend school, had to attend school. They were entitled to a free, appropriate public education. Prior to that, we had students who didn't go. And I've been in the field for a number of years, and I was pleased to see so many hands of people yesterday that are working in special education. I'm sure some of you remember when we started to add students with disabilities into the schools. But even when we did that, it was often separate settings, and we often had different standards for those students. I can remember in the early days of teaching, writing in education plans that we would exempt this student from any state-mandated testing. And the feeling was that, after all, that student had a disability, and why would we put that student through that? But in fact, we were denying that student his or her civil rights to participate equally in the curriculum, in instruction, in evaluation that his or her peers were participating in. And so I've seen that continuum move forward, and I think it's really exciting that we're now saying all students means all students. These students really are included. And so I'm really excited about that.
Thanks, Paul. The all students means all students reminds me that there are actually 4 assessment consortia. There's PARCC and there's Smarter Balance, but there are also 2 assessment consortia that are working on developing assessments for often what are referred to as the 1% of students who are severely or profoundly cognitively disabled. And so for students in that situation, there are separate assessments that are being developed specifically for them, and it amounts to about 1% of the student population, which is how the 1% consortia gets its nickname. The PARCC, however, right, is developing an assessment for the rest of the 99%. And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn to Trinell Bowman, who actually works on the PARCC Operational Working Group for Accessibilities, Accommodations, and Fairness, and ask you to talk just a little bit about how PARCC is approaching this issue. What kinds of things is PARCC doing to design the assessments so that they're accessible for kids?
Well, one of the things, I think that there's been a lot of lessons learned from the development of our alternate assessments, our modified assessments, and our general assessments in various states across the nation. And so one of the things that PARCC is definitely committed to is the use of universal design. And so what that means is we don't want to have an assessment and come back later and have to retrofit accessibility options for students or features or accommodations. And so what we've been committed to and what we've constantly discussed at the beginning is we want to use universal design principles and thinking about all the different diverse student populations that will be taking the PARCC assessment. And so we're moving away from this notion of when you think about accommodations, we're now looking at things that we know as accommodations that may be what we're going to call accessibility features for all students. And so we still know that we may have a need for accommodations, but we're really trying to look at our design and be very intentional and methodical about what are some of those universal design features that are just good practice for all students. And so based on those lessons learned in our own states with the use of universal design, we definitely, with our accessibility guidelines, when those are released, what you will notice is that at the very forefront, we talk about universal design principles and what we mean by universal design. And so we have a list within our accessibility guidelines that speaks first to universal design. The other part that we've been committed to is looking at what we're calling embedded supports. And so when all students sit down to take our PARCC assessment, what are some embedded supports that all students can have access to? Doesn't matter if you have a student that has an IEP or an ELL plan, but we're talking about all students that will encounter the PARCC assessment. So when we think about embedded supports for all students, we're thinking of things like when you sit down at a computer, you're able to enlarge your text on your print. You don't need a plan to do that when you sit down at your computer. So that's kind of one of those universal design features that would be accessible to all students. When you sit down, you have a mechanism to highlight text on your computer screen when you're in the Word, and you're doing a Word document. And so that's kind of another universal design or embedded support that we're looking at all students having access to. And so those are the discussions that we're having as we're thinking about designing the PARCC assessment, but also making sure that we have different reviews along the way in terms of content review, bias and sensitivity reviews, et cetera, to make sure that we're really thinking about our diverse learners and making sure that we're not biased towards any group of students, gender, race, et cetera. PARCC represents a very diverse group of states, and so we're very sensitive to making sure that we have good coverage and representation when our items are being reviewed. So those are just three main points I want to make about what we're thinking about when designing the assessment.
Thanks, Trinell. If you don't mind, a follow-up question. You talked about the types of embedded supports that would be available for all students. There are some specific cases, right? Perhaps students who are deaf or students who are blind who would also need certain accommodations. Has PARCC made any progress in thinking a little bit about what those types of supports or accommodations would look like on the assessment system?
Yes, I can just kind of give you, I have a little list here. Under consideration, and just so you know from a timeline perspective, PARCC is committed to releasing draft accommodation policies this fall. And you as the public would also get an opportunity to be able to look at what those proposed accommodation policies would be and comment on those. And we're committed to finalizing our accommodation policies next spring. But some of the things that are under review and consideration, and one of the things that we're really working really closely with our technical advisory experts for ELL and students with disabilities on, is really what is the research behind certain accommodations. Really making sure we have the research, really understanding how those accommodations are implemented in current states. There may be some accommodations that have not even been used yet that may be new to PARCC, but some of the things that we're currently considering within our assessment is the use of screen readers for students who are blind or have visual impairments, text-to-speech, font size or graphic enlargement, graphic organizers, reducing visual distractors around text. We're working and looking at the use of sign language, either video representation built into the assessment platform or the use of avatars, but again, researching that. We may have video clips included, so we're going to make sure closed captioning is included. And then one of the big areas is really looking at students' response modes. So yesterday I was at an architecture meeting where we're looking and working with our two vendors on looking at what the architecture needs to be with the online testing platform. So one of our big areas of discussion is thinking about our diverse learners and their response needs. And so some of the things that came up yesterday and through discussions this last summer was looking at what are students' response modes from an assistive technology standpoint. What are some of those things that our students will need, such as adaptive keyboards, sticky keys, mouse keys, filter keys, and telekeys, all different types of assistive technology. We want to make sure, again, that we're not retrofitting after the assessment is designed. And so we're thinking about all of the ways that students respond currently in instruction and assessment to make sure that that's built in. So when we release procurement, we're making sure that the vendors are including or considering our students' response mode. The other part that we're looking at is, of course, the use of Braille or possibly refreshable Braille devices. And so we're looking at some of those areas right now as we speak.
Great, thanks. That's quite a long list, actually. Susan, you have quite a bit of expertise in working with English language learners, and what else should PARCC be thinking about as these policies are being developed?
Well, looking at accommodations for ELLs. Looking at the accommodations for ELLs is also important. So many of the things that Trinell had shared were things that would be used for students with disabilities. And what I've used in the past as accommodations was, and really this could be for other students as well, is the extended time. For ELLs, it takes time to understand what the question is saying in English and then trying to figure out content-wise what is the question asking me to do, and then of course time to develop an answer and then sharing that in English. Having dictionaries, I was able to use a dictionary, word-for-word dictionary with students, except for on the ELA exam. Glossaries as well, the glossaries for the content area, the academic language. I had translated tests available. It wasn't for all the tests, however, we had the main tests that were translated were the ones that students needed to graduate. That was very helpful for students who were literate in their native language. And they also were able to have the English version and the translated version side by side. If that wasn't available, we had translators that we were able, the district paid for, and we were able to bring in. And then what would be great is for looking at the different language proficiency levels. You have students who are beginner, intermediate, advanced, and they have different needs based on their experiences. And having for maybe your intermediate or below simplified English versions of the test that, again, simplify it so they're not wading through what is this question saying in English before they can access what do I need to do content-wise to demonstrate what I have learned.
A couple of thoughts come to mind as I heard Trinell explain the accommodations that were being mentioned. And I'm excited, very, very excited about hearing the lengthy list of accommodations that are already being looked at. But I also want to caution us all about the unintended consequences sometimes of those. And as I heard that list, a couple of thoughts came to mind. One was that sometimes what we think is going to be a great accommodation can turn out to have an opposite effect for, say, a different group of students than we intended it for. For example, I heard you mention video clips, and I think that's a great idea, embedding video clips into the assessment. But I can think of certain students who have disabilities that affect nonverbal communication, and their ability to, for example, read facial expression and understand sarcasm or voice tone. In a video clip, the wrong clip could confuse a student as much as help a student, or they wouldn't necessarily get the meaning because part of that clip had that nonverbal communication embedded within it. And so we have to think about some of those subtle things. I'm also thinking about the student who's highly distracted. All of our students can be distracted to some degree, let's be honest, they're children. But there are some students we know are highly distracted, and if we have too many options for them to click and drag and utilize, they may get so caught up with the assistance that we provide them that they don't necessarily get to the heart of the question as well. The other thought I had as you were describing this was our responsibility back in the districts. And that's to really think about what accommodations are needed. Remember, accommodations are providing a level playing field. They're not designed to give an unfair advantage. And so we have to be very thoughtful in those meetings that we hold with parents and with our staff members that we're choosing only the accommodations that students really need to give them equal access to the same assessment, not to give them an unfair advantage. And so we have to be thoughtful about that, and we have to also be careful because there will be those who will want to see students who become eligible for services that they're not necessarily entitled to because they're concerned about how they'll do on the assessment, and they'll be looking to us to make them eligible for special education or some 504 services or something like that so that they can get the accommodations when in fact the student really doesn't warrant them.
Right, and this would be the sole responsibility of the special education teacher to
Exactly.
make all of these determinations about accommodations and so forth, right?
It would be the responsibility of the team.
There we go, right.
It's
So
a team decision. Regular ed, special education, administrators, we're all in this together, and we're all
Right.
making those individualized decisions.